Welcome back. This is World Inside, and I'm Tian Wei. The coming Monday marks this year's Dragon Boat Festival, also known as Duanwu Festival in China. It is an iconic celebration which memorializes the death of an ancient patriotic Chinese poet, Qu Yuan. China is rich with old traditions, with diverse festivities that vary from region to region, but two of them can't be missed, making sticky rice treats, or zongzi, or dragon boat races. So, how does the Dragon Boat Festival look from the outside in? Earlier, I spoke to David Moser, Associate Dean of the Yenching Academy of Peking University. He's a sinologist, linguist who came to China in the 1980s with an enthusiasm to learn Chinese culture. Now, with more than 2 decades of first-hand experiences in China, what's his take on this prominent Chinese festival and the legends behind it? I'm joined by David Moser, Associate Dean of the Yenching Academy of Peking University. What a pleasure to see you, David.
Thank you. Good to see you.
You know, I've always been wondering about the legends behind the Dragon Boat Festival. Mainly it's about the poet, and it's being termed as a patriotic poet.
That's right. In fact, you know, there also is another name for the day, which is Poets' Day. The fifth day of the fifth lunar month, because it's associated so much with Qu Yuan, the famous poet during the Warring States period. Qu Yuan is a very important poet because for several reasons. One is historically he is said to be the first poet who produced poetry under his own name. At least he was one of the first. It seems that many of the earlier poems in the CGTN and other books, they were poets widely read. They were poems that were widely disseminated, but nobody knew who the author was. And Qu Yuan was one of the first people who wrote under his own name, whose poets were known by his name. And yes,
and he's a terrific poet, by the way.
Yes. He is thought of as one of the greatest poets in Chinese history. His famous poem called Li Sao, which is translated usually as Departing Sorrow, is a poetic account of his banishment and his bad treatment by the king of the Chu state, and his fighting with the ministers for patriotic reasons. He was a great patriot, a lover of his country, and that's what he is famous for, yes.
And by the way, just Qu Yuan, you know, where he's coming from, the state of Chu, the reason why he was fallen out of favor by the king was because the king wanted to have his state, the state of Chu, united with the state of Qin, which eventually became the first state that eventually united China. But at that time, Qu Yuan was against that because he thought that's not a good idea for the state of Chu. They might be eventually conquered by Qin. And eventually, it did happen. So how do you see this, you know, this descendant in a way, sense of this being a descendant, played out in the story and the legends? And how is the Chinese related to stories like this?
Qu Yuan was very much against the alliance, and when he found, in fact, that the capital of Chu had been taken over by the Qin, is when he, in despair, threw himself into the Miluo River and committed suicide by drowning, and that, in fact, is the supposed beginning of this dragon boat festival and the practice of eating zongzi,
because sticky, everybody was trying to rush to the river to help to save him, or at least to be able to retrieve his body. Yeah.
Yes. So yes, supposedly the people rushed out in boats to find him and threw rice into the river to just not to feed him, but to distract the fish. that might want to be attacking his body, and that's the origin, the supposed origin of what we eat on the Duanwu, on the Dragon Boat Festival, on the Duanwu, it's called.
You know, poets like him and like Su Dongpo and Du Fu, many of them were fallen out of favor in their time, in a way, politically, but they became extremely important poets in Chinese history. And they have created a certain kind of poetry that would always be admired by you know, the future generations almost of this Chinese nation. How do you see this very interesting phenomenon?
Yes, you're quite right about that. Hasn't been remarked on that much, but you're right. Du Fu, of course, Qu Yuan, almost all the Tang poets were also very much concerned with government and with governance and with the interior political strife in their own country. China is a country, of course, as we know, who has a long history of political tension, of political animosity, contradictions, and war. And very often these poets were writing in the midst of war-torn areas, in the midst of war-torn epics. And it is striking how much the poetry of Chinese poets through the centuries has dealt with the sorrows of war, of tragedy, of loss of loved ones, of exile, of banishment, and of political struggles, and the fate of the country. Very often the motivation of their poems is the sense of tragedy, the sense of loss, and also a sort of patriotic sense of hope that the country can move on to a better place. Qu Yuan is probably the primary example, but I think it's the fact that China has for so long, through its many centuries, tragically been fraught with natural and human tragedies and political upheavals and territorial struggles and strife. So yeah, this is something I think important about Chinese arts in general, but specifically poetry.
It's fascinating, you know, just with one festival and one or two of the legends related to the festival, one would be able to know so much. You know, with all these years of research, what do you make of the things that's going on right now? You know, the confusion about who China is, what China wants to do, and also within China, what is China and how much is Chineseness, what is the best about our Chineseness, what to maintain and what to enrich. You know, all of these debates, as a cultural expert, how do you see that?
But what I've always been interested in the results of my research, because I do research on Chinese language.
Yes.
And that entails search on various Chinese regional dialects and regional forms of speech. And I guess the takeaway of all of this, and it has to do with the Dragon Boat Festival as well, is China's a very, very diverse nation. It's not this sort of monolith that people tend to think it is. Even with the celebration of these festivals, like the Duanwu, in different parts of China, the actual persons or historical personage being celebrated are different people.
Yes.
So in Zhejiang, for example, they might be commemorating a female named Cao E, whose father died of drowning in another lake, and she jumped in and with filial piety to find the body of her father and spent 3 days, and she herself drowned also. So when they eat zongzi and they still do the dragon boat, they're commemorating someone else. And even the zongzi, that is the traditional food, the glutinous rice cakes, are different in different parts of China.
Indeed.
In the north, they have the sweet kind. In the south, they're more salty kind with egg and meat. And there's even north-south disputes about which one is better. I've seen online disputes like with the people from the south.
And that's a really serious debate, by the way. You know, for the Chinese, very serious debate. Yeah.
Exactly. So anyway, the uptake of all of this is that China is to this day a very diverse nation. You might think of China as being basically as diverse as Europe, but encompassed in one political entity, with all including the Han nationalities and then the minority nationalities, all in one big country and all celebrating the same festivals and doing and eating some of the same foods, but also different.
Hopefully, understanding the fact that China is as diverse as it is would help some people to understand the complexity and the different layers of issues related to China, which they are working on. Hopefully.
Hopefully, China. This is one of China's strengths, but it's also one of its problems. Even my country, it's one of our strengths. It's one of our difficulties is diversity. China has a great deal of diversity, and that diversity also includes areas, pockets of poverty, and pockets of incredible wealth. And one of the challenges is to bring all those diverse elements together and create a country. And China's done an amazing job of unifying such a diverse country. Maybe things like the Dragon Boat Festival, cultural aspects like the Dragon Boat Festival, are a way in which all these different groups can come together, celebrate a common cause. And now that Qu Yuan is the official sort of poet and the traditional nationalistic and patriotic poet, he can be a sort of a focus of the entire nation during this holiday. And I'm sure his name will come up on TV shows and kids will be studying him in school. So
Absolutely.
This is just one aspect of how the festival can create unity out of diversity.
I recited his poetry when I was a school student. Hopefully I would be able to refresh it after our talk today. After all, he's a great poet. It's a great poet.
Well, I would love to hear you recite it next time I see you.
For now, I want to thank you, David Moser. Thank you
Sure.
for joining us, and I hope you enjoy your Dragon Boat Festival holiday together with your students at Peking University and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Earlier, my interview with David Moser about the legends behind the Dragon Boat Festival. As the festival draws near, we pay tribute to poets in Chinese contemporary history. In the 1980s, just as China was beginning to give the world a glimpse of its rich heritage, literature and the arts were blossoming among the younger generations then. Many brilliant young poets at the time breathed life into words that moved, inspired, enlightened, and invigorated the readers. I spoke with one of China's contemporary poets, Chuan. He shared his unique insights as a wordsmith and how he approaches his and his peers' work with such poetic license. By the way, he also has developed through decades a love for ancient Chinese poetry.
Between poetry and philosophy, or between poetry, maybe a religion or something else.
That's very interesting.
It's between us.
Can you give us some examples?
After 1992, I started to write prose poems, and lots of Chinese readers, they were not used to my way of writing after 1992, and they feel that that's not poetry, because ordinary people, they understand that poetry should be in lines with rhymes.
You want to break that?
Yeah, I want to.
What did you do?
I brought some ideas into poetry writing. I feel that poetry is not, poetry, this word is not only for lyrical poetry, because usually people feel that to give ideas, that's a task of philosophers. But I feel that poets also have, they need to at least to know something about these philosophical things. I have a series of poems. There's one, the title is What the Eagle Says. I'm trying to talk in a crazy way, I have to say. Oh, I have another series of poems that is, I try to give definitions to words. For instance, bird. And bird, you have a definition in a dictionary. And I'm trying to give new definitions. I invented. Not only about birds, about city, about this term city, this word, about what else? Fire or shadow. And I try to give the definition in a very official way. But
Chuan Wei. Chuan's official version.
But what I talk there, what I have there, could be something absurd.
We are very much looking forward to listening to those poems.
Yeah. Grandmother. My grandmother coughs, waking 1,000 roosters. 1,000 roosters crow, waking 10,000 people. 10,000 people walk out of the village. Roosters in the village still crowing. The crowing roosters stop. My grandmother still coughing. My still coughing grandmother mentions her grandmother, her voice getting softer, as if it were my grandmother's grandmother's voice getting softer. My grandmother talks and talks, then stops, shutting her eyes, as if it were only now that my grandmother's grandmother really died.
What interests you the most these days?
I've finished a very long essay on Tang poetry. Chinese people, it seems that the Chinese people had a definite way of in reading these poets. So I'm trying to tell something new, to tell something fresh, to give new ways in reading these poets.
But why? I mean, Xu Zhuan, why? Chinese society is changing so fast.
Yes.
Why do you have to go back?
Actually, you've given me the answer. That is, the Chinese society changed so rapidly, and then because of this, right? Because of this, I am having a way of looking at Tang Dynasty society.
What do you mean by that?
For instance, what's the relationship between poetry writing and the social changes? And you can't read Tang poetry only according to, only as dead poems, only as knowledge. But they are heritages for us. But the poets from Tang Dynasty, when they were writing the poems, they were writing just like us writing at this time. The social changes, gives me such an opportunity to find something new there in Tang poetry.
What did you find?
Because, for instance, in Tang Dynasty, there are also monk poets. And so beside Li Bai and Du Fu, there were poets like Han Shan, who's very famous in other countries, in the United States, in Europe. His name was translated into like this, the Cold Mountain. But in Chinese, that's Han Shan. And, but Han Shan was not the only monk poet from Tang Dynasty. There is another person, his name is Wang Fanzhi, and also a very famous monk of Zen Buddhism, Huineng. They wrote with a kind of vernacular Chinese. They were away from the mainstream of the Tang Dynasty. And that, for me, that's quite interesting.